everyone, and welcome to the IBJ podcast, where I interview tech leaders, entrepreneurs, and researchers. Today, my guest is Andreas Aristidou. Andreas holds a PhD in economics and works as a senior data scientist at Netflix. Among other things, we discuss the value of asking questions during an interview and skills needed to collaborate with product managers. I'm super excited to have you on my first podcast. So, Andreas, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. And it's a privilege to be a guest, especially your first guest on this podcast. So I'm very honored. My name is Andreas Aristidou. I'm currently a senior data scientist at Netflix. I joined a week ago. Yeah, I'll just keep it brief and then we can just take it from there and explore.
Feel free to give a bit of background of how you got to be a data scientist at Netflix. What did you study? Why did you study it? Where did you work? How did you get where you are, basically?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. There's a super long version and a shorter version, I guess. So like you, I completed my PhD in economics at USC. I also got my master's in computer science from USC as well, which we can get into later as to how that happened. But yeah, I came to the US in 2015 to do my PhD in economics. And before that, I was born and raised in Cyprus, in that little island in the Mediterranean. And then I did my undergrad and master's studies in the UK, in Australia, and in Spain. And then I wanted to continue pursuing the academic route. And what better place to do that than the US? And I also wanted to be in a place that has good weather. LA seemed like the perfect fit for both of that. When I got into USC for my PhD in economics, I was very excited. I came here in 2015, graduated in 2020. And then after a short stint in economic consulting, I joined Zillow as an applied scientist full-time for about 2.5 years. And right now, to the present day, I just joined Netflix as a senior data scientist. And yeah, that's a more kind of like condensed version of my background.
So, why did you decide to do a PhD program in economics? I guess two parts of the question: why PhD and why economics?
Yeah, it was so growing up, I didn't really know anything about what a PhD is or even the word PhD. I had never heard of it before. I don't really have any other PhD in my family. But so the story goes a little bit further back in my high school and deciding what to study for my undergrad studies. And I was really torn between economics and psychology. It was two topics that I was super, super interested in. And I was deciding between either studying economics or psychology. But in the end, I ended up with pursuing a bachelor's in economics. And I was lucky, very lucky, that I joined the University of Nottingham in the UK to pursue my bachelor's in economics. And the reason why I'm saying I was very lucky is because Nottingham is one of the top universities in the world for research in behavioral economics, which at the time I had zero idea what that thing was or had even heard the phrase before. But once I joined Nottingham, during my second year, I believe, there was a class called Behavioral and Experimental Economics. I thought that was really interesting. And then I took that class, and I remember it to this day. At the end of the very first lecture we had, I remember the professor who then became my advisor. I was like, this is the most interesting thing I've ever done or heard of in my life. And that's how the why of the PhD in economics started. I started getting really interested in the topic of behavioral economics. I started reading research papers. I started running after all the professors and begging them to have me as a research assistant. I started taking part in economic experiments that they were running studies on. And I just started getting more and more involved. And I learned about a PhD. And that's how it started. I just got really interested in a subtopic of economics, which is called behavioral economics, which really combines the two things that I was really interested in, which is economics and psychology. And that's how my target became to do a PhD in economics and really research and study further that topic and to write papers of my own. I remember reading a lot of those papers that we're doing in the class, and I was like, I want to do my own. One day I want to have my own research paper in behavioral economics.
How do you feel behavioral economics compares to psychology? Right? Because you could potentially have decided to do a PhD in psychology. What is it about economics that makes it different than just straight up psychology?
Yeah, disclaimer, I honestly don't know much about pure psychology.
Yeah.
I took one class in my first year of undergrad. And having taken that class, I was pretty happy I didn't go the psychology route because I think for me, economics combined a lot of my other interests in how do people interact with each other and agents in an economy, which I guess in a way maybe psychology does that too. I honestly don't know a lot about the pure psychology route, but it felt like industrial organization and also the more technical aspect of economics is something that really was attractive to me. The math aspect was, even though I would never call myself I was never a math was never my strong suit, but it was something that was attractive to me. And the more technical, the more data driven aspect that economics seemed to have at the time was something that attracted me more in economics. But having said that, I honestly don't have such a strong background in pure psychology.
Yeah. Having done the PhD, and I guess not coming from a pure math background, how much math would you say is necessary to comfortably survive the PhD?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It almost felt like an undergrad in economics is not the best thing to do if you want to do a PhD in economics, which might sound strange at first. And it's something that I got to find out the hard way in a way, because my undergrad in economics in the UK was not, it had some math, but it wasn't up to the level that was required for a PhD in economics. So I'm very glad that before my undergrad and my PhD, I did a master's in economics in Spain at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona School of Economics, where it was really like a very strong introduction into more pure math concepts like proofs and real analysis, topology, and more econometrics and things like that. But yeah, to answer your question, I think the more math, the better. And obviously, there's a point diminishing returns as in almost everything. Yeah. But I do want to, having said that, I do want to say that it's doable even if you don't have a good background in math. Because I didn't have a good background in math, but you can just, if you're really determined and you really want to do it, you can grind it out and figure things out. I would recommend taking a few math, like pure math classes, but I also want to speak out to people who may not have that background and say that it's okay. And if you really want to do this, it's doable. I did not have that background. Right. I suffered a little bit because of it, but I came on the other side, and so it's doable. But preferable if you do have some more pure math.
Yeah. And I guess you don't have to go overboard. I recently met someone who did a PhD in theoretical physics before doing the PhD in economics. That's maybe not necessary, yeah. And I come from a math background, so I don't have as good as a perspective on how much math do you need because I had sufficient. But I think to your point, like I had economics in my undergrad, but my economics was really basic compared to people I know who come from good schools in Latin America where they basically did PhD level micro and macro. I had Econ 101, and that really wasn't an issue. So I think to your point, you could do an undergrad in math or in whatever, physics, and still do a PhD in economics and be fine.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think whatever you do, as you learn economics, there's trade-offs in pretty much everything. And so if you have a very strong math background, then that's great for the math part, but then you may lack some of the economic intuition. But then if you have a very strong economics background, you might have that, but lack a little bit of the technical skills, the math skills. But anything is doable. And so you can learn, if you're determined enough, you can get those skills acquired.
The one thing I would imagine is if you go to a school that has a core exam in econometrics, you probably want to have more math. Because we done at USC, right? And I know some schools are really tough on the econometrics part.
Yeah, the econometrics can be more math than others, but I still think it's, again, I mean, a few math classes will definitely be advantageous, but I still believe it's doable. If you don't have a strong math background, yeah, you can do it. Also, a lot of the economics textbooks have a great appendix, which usually teaches you a lot of the skills you need to know. I remember the Mas-Colell microeconomics textbook.
Yeah.
It had an extended appendix, and I just read all of it, and it was just very good preparation for what was to come.
So did you go into the PhD thinking you wanted to do pure research?
Oh yeah, yes, 100%. I came into the PhD 100% convinced that I would pursue an academic career. There was no other alternative in my mind. At the time, things changed along the way, but yeah, when I was deciding to pursue a PhD in economics, I was doing that as a stepping stone to become a professor and continue doing research.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I thought the same thing when I did my PhD, and
Yeah.
I guess look at us. And so when I started my PhD, I somehow had this idea of research being some kind of extremely elevated intellectual endeavor, I guess, to put it that way. That it was like the purest form of intellectual exercise you could possibly do in this world. And so I'm curious, what was it along the way that made you realize you didn't want to do research in academia?
I'm also laughing because I had the exact same thoughts as you just. I could have said it the same way of what I thought research was. And I think to some extent, some part of it is that, but then there's a lot of other parts of it. So I think for me, what I so I think there's a couple of reasons why I decided that the academic route was not for me. Number one is publication. I think I really hated the publication aspect of research. And I remember there's a couple of papers that I can say I was truly in love with the research idea. I I was working on those papers day and night, not because I had to, but I was just so in love with the idea. I was just so in it. And that continued for a couple of years till the papers were pretty much done. From the research idea, how we got the data, or an experiment in one case, the analysis, putting together the results, all the different results, making together a coherent story, and writing a paper. But then, and even presenting in our conferences was something else. I really liked that. But then a big part of being an academic is publishing those papers. And that was a whole different game. One that I didn't know much about and one that I didn't really like. And I realized that I ended up like hating some of those papers that I created. I used to love because of the grind of the publication process. And to this day, 5 years later, my papers are still in the pipeline for publication. And I think just a couple of points of what that I didn't like is like the true real research, it ends about a year. Like for a year, you do the truly innovative research where you come up with a research question, you read the literature, you come up with something new, you gather data, you analyze it, you produce a paper. That takes, I don't know, maybe from 6 months to a year and a half. It really depends. But then there's another 3 to 4 year period where you're going through the publication process of submitting your paper, waiting for 6 to 8 months to hear back, getting back a variety of feedback from reviewers that sometimes makes sense, sometimes it doesn't make much sense. There's a lot of ego in academia, and there's a lot of politics, unfortunately, which is something I got to learn in my last 2 years of the PhD program, which I was very surprised because I came in with similar mindset of this is purely an intellectual exercise. But you get to find out there's a lot of egos and there's a lot of politics involved. And then I just realized that from the cycle of coming up with the research idea to publishing it, I would say 70% of it was the publication process, which I didn't like. So most of that process, I really didn't like. And I was looking, ideally, I would have wanted to just do the research part and not the publication part, which is why I discovered the world of tech and I joined the world of tech, which was much more research at a much faster pace.
Okay, so yeah, and you don't have to publish.
Yes, exactly. And really quickly, the other part which really made me switch is the location, because I have a very strong location preferences. I come from Cyprus, which is the weather is really nice, and I have a very strong bias towards warm climates. And if you really want to be a professor, you need to be quite flexible in your location preferences. And I could not imagine myself living in a really cold, for example, or like either cold climate or just a very isolated location. So
Yeah.
that was another reason why I thought that the academic world was not for me.
Yeah, no, and it's extremely random, right, where you end up, because you send, I don't even know how many, like 200 applications, and then you get 10 flyouts, and then you get 2 offers.
Yeah,
and it can be
pretty
like
much.
wherever. So for people who are econ PhDs and who want to work in the industry, and I guess probably tech specifically,
Okay.
what recommendations do you have? Because at least for me, the experience was, and I did my PhD I did an internship in the last summer of my PhD, and I actually extended my PhD 1 year to be able to do an internship, because you still have to be a student to do an internship. And I realized there were many things I wished I had known before. But at least where we went to school, and we went to the same school for those who don't know, they really don't tell you about that kind of stuff, because they were, at least at that time, more focused on the academic career.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. Even though I think and I hope that things are changing a little bit in PhD economics programs as more and more economists are embedded in the tech world. But yes, I would validate what you just said in that an internship, I think, is a great way to one, get to learn, get to like experience a company, a tech company, or economic consulting, or something else like a research institute, think tank, depending on what you're after. But I think an internship is a great way to get to experience that environment. But also, it's a great signal to employers that you have those skills, to the skill, some particularly soft skills that are required more in tech and in other industries. And I think I would say soft skills are probably the biggest change from academia to tech. And collaboration and teamwork, it's one of those things that I found to be the most different from academia, particularly in economics, because I think other disciplines, they work more in labs, so it's much more collaborative, the work. But in economics, we tend to do basically work on ourselves. Most papers, or a lot of the papers, are solo authored. And so people spend hours and days and weeks and months by themselves working on a project, which is unheard of in most industries.
Yeah. So
And so, yeah, I think giving out a credible signal that I can work with others in a collaborative environment is very strong, even though there's also other ways of doing that as well. For example, I was part of a few labs like that were multidisciplinary, like an AI lab, which had different people from psychology, computer science, economics, and other social sciences. So there's other ways to show that, but that's an important skill that an internship can really give you, and also give you as a signal to other employers.
Yeah. Do you have any tips on how to? So when you got your internship, did you just apply to internships on LinkedIn, or how did you get your foot in the door, so to say? That's a question I think I get often from people who don't have experience.
I'll tell you what I did, but I'll also tell you what I would recommend. So I purely just applied places I remember I used LinkedIn and Google. I think they're two sources I used the most. I had a Google alert, which would email me every day for any new positions that matched any keywords. And of course, LinkedIn. LinkedIn has, I would say, most, especially if you're looking for tech. I think LinkedIn by far has the most such openings. So that's what I did. Though learning more as I, matured in the tech world a little bit, connections matter a lot. And a lot of people are willing to talk to you without knowing you. Coming from academia, that may sound strange a little bit, but there's a lot of people who are willing to respond to a stranger's message on LinkedIn. and first of all, share their experience with you, and second, potentially give you a referral for a position. And a referral, for those who don't know, is basically an internal system where someone who works at a company says that I've spoken or I know a particular person and I think they might be a good fit for this position. And it really helps your application to be noticed. It's probably not going to get you in a company for sure, but it's going to give you a higher chance to be noticed by the recruiter. So one way to do it is find people on LinkedIn that work at a company that you're interested in that may have an opening, and ask them to either chat with you or just straight up ask for a referral. And you'll be surprised. A lot of people may not reply, but you'll be surprised by how many people will reply and will.
Yeah. And I think the component to mention here is often companies have incentives for referring people. If I refer someone and they actually end up getting hired, they would pay me a referral bonus, which can be actually quite high at some companies.
Yeah.
So it's definitely incentive compatible to refer qualified people.
Exactly. And there's no downside as well. So that's why most people are willing to
do it. There could be, depending on the culture of the company. Sometimes if you start referring people who are not good, you could lose your reputation.
Yeah.
So I personally wouldn't recommend that, but ask for a resume. And often the referring person will know more than the recruiter about whether that person is qualified or not. Because you will often get questions from recruiters or, okay, can you look at this resume and tell me what you think? Because if they're hiring for data scientist positions, the recruiter doesn't know often the details of what a data scientist does.
Yeah, I feel like it can be a hit or miss. Some recruiters are actually well-versed, but it depends. But yeah, I think you're right. So probably a better way is to ask to meet, ask for 15 minutes chat with someone. And then in 15 minutes, they can talk about themselves, you can talk about yourself, and then see if they would give you a referral. So that's another good way to do it. But it's of course more time-consuming, but it's probably worth it.
I think what I would do, I would reach out and I would be like, hey, I'm interested in this position. This is why I think I'm good for it. 3 bullet points. Attach my resume, because it's annoying when you get that question like that and then you're like, have to reply and ask them for the resume. And then also say, if you would like to, I'm happy to talk to you. And then you give them all the information so they could just refer you. But if they actually want to talk to you, they could also do that.
Yeah, actually, recently, a connection of mine reached out to me to broker a conversation with a connection of mine, another connection of mine who was working at a company that connection A was interested in getting. So that's another way of, if there's someone that you want to talk to that maybe is connected to someone, that's another way to do it. And actually, the other thing that I would say in general for applications, and it might not sound the most scientific way of doing something, but it really comes down to numbers. There are several positions that you might be really interested in, but I would encourage you to send out a lot of applications because there's a lot of randomness in this process. And first of all, there's a lot of randomness in the process. And second, a lot of the places that might be hiring, or they may have a posting out, the real job might be stale, or they might be on hiring freeze, and you don't really know that. And a lot of times the job description doesn't give you the full picture of what a job will be. So I would, and this is the advice that I give to most people, is do send out a lot of applications. The cost is pretty low. And send out a lot of applications. And worst case scenario is you get interview practice.
Yeah. And I think the other one is network with recruiters if you can. Because you make their job easier if you reveal to them you're a qualified candidate. Because it's actually surprisingly hard to hire qualified people.
It is, especially as the demands for data scientists and applied scientists, research scientists, the demand is growing exponentially. And the supply is, I would say it's increasing, but I wouldn't say it's increasing at the same rate as demand is. So put yourself out there, send out your resume to a bunch of places, and just make yourself known. And interview experience is a real thing. It is a very real thing. And so Worst case, you get an interview with a place that you maybe not be that much interested in, but still practicing your how you talk about yourself, maybe a coding interview or something else. It's going to be very valuable for the future.
So I guess since we're talking about interviews, do you have any interview tips from your experience interviewing?
Yeah, I reiterate my number one interview tip is just send. It sounds just so unscientific, but literally, I do think that sending out a lot of applications is important. I've been both an applicant, but also on the other side of things. And there's a lot of randomness in the process. A lot of times the hiring manager is not sure exactly what they're looking for. Maybe they have an idea, but they don't know, they're not 100% sure what they're. So maybe you could convince them that you're a qualified candidate. And a lot of the times a position that may not sound interesting might be more interesting than it sounds, and the opposite.
Yeah, that's
So I would say send in a bunch of applications and also practice a lot, practice interview. And how do you do that? By applying to a lot of places and getting those interviews. Recently, I also went through, as I was changing jobs, one thing I found quite helpful in studying, preparing for different sections of the interview, for example, a Python coding or SQL coding, or even some machine learning, causal inference, I found ChatGPT actually quite helpful. Even though, disclaimer, ChatGPT can make a lot of mistakes. But what it can really do for you, it can really summarize things. And if you already have some domain knowledge, you can kind of get a sense of what's right and what's wrong. But it can really be helpful in generating example, even like coding questions and providing solutions for them. That's another tool that I've used that was quite helpful for me. Yeah. What else? I don't know. Be just showing that you can work with others is really important, especially for I think coming in with a PhD, a concern that people have that are hiring is whether you can work with others. So just presenting yourself in a nice way, talking about yourself and about highlighting projects that you did with others. Teamwork is another important aspect that people are looking for. Yeah, I don't know what else, but I think these are some, I would say, the first things that I would say.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the knowing, as you said, that interviewing is also about knowing how to answer questions in a way that is structured. I think that's the big thing. And to some extent, it's practice, right? Doing the STAR answer framework: situation, task, action, result.
Yeah, totally. I remember looking at the STAR method, which is I think it's a great framework to use. I don't know if I'm ever explicitly thinking about that way when I explain an answer, but I do think that it's really good to. I think STAR it just makes sense. Like you give a little bit of information about the background, about the situation, you give a little bit of information about what you did, give a little bit of information about what the results were and what the impact was. So it's just like it's a framework that can make sense. So don't talk 15 minutes about the analysis. Maybe give a broad description of the background.
Yeah. So, do you have any tips for what people should be looking for in their first job? Because I think often what happens is that you are a PhD student, and then when you're looking for your first job, you would be so excited to get any job offer that you would probably take it. And I think obviously with time you learn what to look for. And of course, when you take your first job, you have, I guess, a smaller choice set to some extent because you don't have as much experience. But there are still some pitfalls and some like red flags and green flags to look for.
Yeah, definitely. But even though I do agree that, and being realistic, I think most candidates, most, not all, won't have that many choices. I think in reality, you probably won't have that many choices. And so you will end up taking like the first one or two that you get. But a few things you wanna look at is I think you wanna be in an environment where you gain skills. And one thing that I was really happy about my first position was that it was kind of like in the middle, collaborating with different teams. And so you really get exposure to things that you don't have exposure in the PhD program. versus there are some, and again, it also depends a little bit on your preference. I would say actually depends a lot on your preferences, but there are positions that are very specialized and very specialized in particular research areas, which can be great if that's what you really want to do. But reality is that in tech, you really need to have a lot of the coding skills that we don't develop as much in the PhD. And so one thing that I would look for is a place where you would be at least exposed to SQL, like extracting data from a data lake or a database management system would be important. Also, being able to work with product managers and like product is also quite important because it really trains your collaboration and teamwork skills. And so being in a team where you're not the only one and you're not working only on a specialized project, because it is something that I think the rest of the tech world really wants. So they want someone who has skills in different areas.
So you're basically saying is that if you pick your first job where you're exposed to all those things, you basically get trained and that increases your market value for the next job you're going to look for.
You said it perfectly. Yes, that's yeah.
And so you mentioned, for example, working with a product manager. What specifically is it that is a skill in working with a product manager, for example, that this maybe not everyone has, right?
Yeah, so a product manager, for context, I didn't know what a product manager was before I joined Zillow. It's they're people who have a very strong business context, and they act as kind of like a coordinator for a particular project or a product, and they coordinate things like researchers, for example, like yourself, data scientists, designers. They can coordinate consumer research, engineering, and make sure that everyone is aligned and working on the same goal, which is the goals of that product.
Yeah.
Usually they have backgrounds in like their MBAs or some more business backgrounds. So this type of role is everywhere in tech and in most other industries. So some skills you'll need to work with them. Number one, teamwork, and teamwork not just with the product manager, but collaborating with so many different types of job functions. And when I say teamwork can mean a lot of different things. Number one, asking for help. I think that's one big thing that I learned at my time in tech so far. Asking for help is so important. And people do it naturally, but coming from a PhD program, it doesn't come naturally to you, especially for little things. Number two, setting and committing deadlines, which is another thing that I think that in the PhD program were much more kind of like free flowing, kind of like working on research with no particular deadlines.
Yeah, and deadlines also tended to be like, in 3 years, I'm going to do my dissertation, right? Like
Yes.
That's not the deadline in tech.
Yes, no, you don't see such timelines. Usually timelines will be in weeks or maybe months at most.
Yeah, like a quarter would be the right?
Yeah, or quarterly planning. A lot of companies do quarterly planning. And so just being able to say, I will be able to get this done in 2 months and be able to commit to that. First of all, know how long something is going to take is a skill, and being able to get it done. And another big thing I would say is the ability to explain complex research in a simple way that is understandable both by people that don't have the skills that you have. In the same way as you don't have the skills that they do, but being able to explain why your research findings are valid and are important and shouldn't be ignored in favor of intuition, for example, sometimes. Because a lot of business people go with intuition, and you bring in some of the research, explaining your findings and going into some details about how you got there, how you collected the data, how you did the analysis, but without going into too much detail such that people get confused.
Yeah.
That's a big skill.
Yeah, and I guess the way to think about it is basically they are your customer. So unless you can sell them your solution, they're not going to feel comfortable using it. And coming from academia, some people might think you could say something like, my estimator is unbiased and I have a good identification strategy that relies on an instrumental variable, right? That doesn't mean anything to most people.
That doesn't mean anything. And actually, if anything, it might harm your chance of selling what you produce. Yeah, I think you said it really well. Once again, is a little bit of sales skills of distilling your research into easily digestible slides or a share out, and having the confidence and the selling ability to get buy-in for what you've produced.
Yeah. And so you mentioned so far asking for help, ability to plan deadlines and deliver according to deadlines, and ability to explain nerdy things in a way that everyone can understand. Is there anything
Yes.
else you would add to the key skill set of a technical person working in a tech setting?
I think I would put those skills in an umbrella which is called professional communication. I do think that for people with our backgrounds who are coming from PhDs and other highly technical backgrounds, professional communication is very important. And some aspects are asking for help, another aspect is explaining findings, but it broadens into, especially as you level up, how do you gain buy-in for specific research projects? Then how do you gain buy-in for promotions or for extra headcount? Or if there's disagreement, there's a lot of times there's disagreement, there's egos. How do you manage that? How do you, let me give you a concrete example. Someone brings in an argument that you disagree with. How do you disagree with that? That is a skill. In academia, we feel free to kind of stand up and say, this is wrong, or this is yes, or
Stupid.
something stupid. But in the professional world, you cannot do that. And just putting all of this under the umbrella of professional communication is, I would say, the number one
Yeah,
recommendation.
and I agree on the on the really being able to push back on ideas part, right? Because I think if you see something that doesn't make sense, often it's important to communicate that it maybe doesn't make sense, but to do it in a good way. And that obviously will depend on the circumstance and the project, many things. But I think, for
Yeah,
example, when you talked about the planning and deadlines, maybe your manager would come and propose an objective and a deadline that's much too short of a timeline to actually do the thing. And you may have to push back, but you can't say, I can't do it in whatever, in 4 weeks, but you would have to explain why. So I think it's being able to back things with data, I guess what it boils down to.
exactly. Putting data, and I guess if it's one more thing is, I would say, in a way, this is a very broad word, but empathy. Empathy of, because you're going to be working with people that are so different from you with very different backgrounds. And a lot of times, which I think I've seen, is I tend to approach things in a very structured and logical and scientific way. But sometimes there's a lot of things that I would never think about. For example, legal considerations. I
Yeah.
think legal considerations are so important. I would have never thought of those things coming into, I think, from a PhD. And when you're in academia, you don't really think about those things, or
Yeah.
how one intervention may, on average, improve something, but may harm particular groups that you may don't want to harm. And other people do think about those things. And so it's important to also have empathy for where do other people come from, what is their background, and how their ideas may not make sense from your own perspective, but they actually may make a lot of sense from someone else's perspective. And talking about product managers that we just talked before, a lot of times what they say may not make sense to you, but they have a little bird's eye view of different teams. And so being more patient and empathetic with others' viewpoints is very important.
Yeah. And I think this applies really broadly to life,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
That there is this saying, always when someone talks, assume you could learn something from them. And I guess if you come at it from a viewpoint of we want to solve a problem here and we just want to have the best solution to the problem, it's easier to have that frame of mind to listen, which obviously doesn't mean it's always easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy, especially if you have not been practicing that. And I would say academia didn't prepare me for this very well. It prepared me for in a lot of other ways, but in this way, it didn't give me the tools to think about such very diverse perspectives. And that's something I've had to develop a lot.
Yeah. So coming into, say, your first job, whether it's from a PhD or from an undergrad, and this is actually something I want to come back to, because I want to ask you about whether you think it's worth it to do the PhD or when it's worth it. But regardless of where you come from, on your first job, your manager is obviously going to matter a lot. And what do you think one should look for in your first manager? And when you interview, you more often than not, you will talk to your potential future manager. So what would you ask the person? What would you look for?
Yeah, that's a big question, man. It's probably one of the things I've learned the most. I think coming into my first job, I honestly didn't really know what managers did. 3 years later, I would say your manager is by far the most important person in your professional life. And they can really help create an incredible experience or a terrible experience for you, regardless of what the rest of the company is doing. So really having a good manager is really important. But a good manager, I would say, also depends on who you are and how you connect with someone. So a couple of things that I think are important, but also they depend on your personality as well. I remember when I first interviewed with my first manager, Brian Caldwell, which I truly love. He's an incredible person and he's a role model for me. One of the things that he really highlighted, which really resonated with me, is that it's a very bottom up team on organization. I'm going to bring you in, I think, and I presume that you're a smart guy, and I'm going to give you some pointers. And my job, how I see my job, now I'm talking as what he was saying and paraphrasing, of course. And so, what my job will be is to be there as a support for you to help enable you to do your best work. And that's what he did throughout as long as he was my manager. He really allowed me to go out there and innovate, find out where I can contribute the most and go for it. And whenever I got blocked, whenever others were blocking me in a way, he was there to support me, coach me, mentor me, and really help me, enable me. I would say enabling is a good word, enable me to really do my best work. But other managers see things differently. And I honestly wouldn't say that there is a right or wrong way. It really depends on who you are and what you want. But I've also been under other managers who were much more micromanaging and what's it called? Top bottom? They're much more top down. It's other managers, their style is much more, this is a project, this is what I need you to do, and you need to get this done in this way, in this exact way, and it needs to get done by this deadline. And they have very specific views of what is right and what is wrong and how something should be done, which for me, it can really limit your innovation, your ability to really bring in new ideas and new things to the table. But I do want to highlight again that I don't really think for me, there's what I prefer, but others, I definitely thrived and preferred the first type of manager who really enabled me to go out there and innovate. But others might prefer having more guidance, might feel more safe having more strict guidance.
Yeah.
So it really depends on what you want, but that's one aspect which I found that for me really changed how I could work and how I felt every day in my job.
Yeah. And I think this is something to be aware of, and this is something I think you can gauge to a semi-large extent in an interview, because you can just ask the manager what their managing philosophy is, and a good manager, regardless of their style, should be open to answering the question. If they start giving you weird answers, that's a red flag. And I also think, going back to the PhD versus non-PhD topic, I think the extent to which you quote unquote should micromanage someone, although I don't like the word micromanage, maybe give them more or less well-defined tasks is how I would think about it. If someone comes in and is an undergraduate straight out of school, it's good for them probably to get a pretty well-defined task so that they have some structure within which they can innovate. And then you have someone who has a PhD, right? They're more used to answering ambiguous questions. So I think it should be experience appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. And I think taking a step back on what you mentioned previously, I would encourage people as an interview in during your interviews to ask that question. For me, when I was first interviewing for my first job and my internships, I was too scared to ask something like that. I was like, who am I to ask this person like what their management style is? But in my second round of interviews, I asked that question a lot, and it was indeed very, very enlightening for me. And a good manager will actually appreciate you asking that question. It will show maturity. Now, a bad manager may not appreciate that question, which is actually what you want. But I think a good manager will appreciate you taking the initiative, not being afraid to just ask this question. And it can really give you a sense of their management style. And a lot of managers, I've also seen that they would go into details of how, for example, they may say, once you join, a couple of weeks later, we're going to do a session where we're going to discuss how do you prefer to communicate. I will try to adjust. For example, if you prefer communicating through Slack, or do you prefer email, or do you prefer to be contacted regularly, or like maybe once a day or once a week. So some managers will really have those things well defined, and they will communicate those things to you. So that's a great question to ask, and I would highly encourage everyone to ask
everyone. Yeah, and I think it's a really important point not to have an inferiority complex when suppose it's your first job and you're straight from undergrad. You can still, and you should, ask these questions, right? So of course there's a difference between being entitled and being communicative. And I think the kind of question, as you said, it shows maturity, and I think it also shows genuine interest. And it also shows that you have good communication skills because you're not afraid to ask something that's a potentially harder question to ask. So I really think you can't go wrong with asking this question in a nice and really curious way.
Yeah, as long as you said, of course, it can, if you take it to the extreme, it can feel like you're entitled, but as long as you're respectful and you ask it in a nice way, in a genuine way, because you're genuinely interested in how this relationship is going to work, which is really important. And so if you're genuinely interested, and just like generally ask that question because you want to make sure that you and your manager, who you're going to work so closely together, you have similar working styles.
Or at least compatible, right?
Maybe just compatible. Yeah.
And so you obviously have worked with people who are PhDs and people who don't have PhDs. And so in your experience, would you say the PhD was worth it? And more in general, when would you say it's worth it or not?
Yeah, so I like that you added the word when, because that's what my answer is based on. I don't think that there's a universal, it's worth it or not worth it. For me, it was 100% worth it. I would have definitely done it again. Granted, I would have done it a little bit differently. There were some areas of focus that I would have focused more on, and some areas of focus that I would have focused less on, and I would have been much more focused on particular things. But for me, it was definitely worth it because I was really interested in particular topics, and I got to really study things deeply. However, I wouldn't say that it's either necessary or even helpful for many job functions. And those skills, you can easily get the skills you'll need in the industry, you can get them along the way. Of course, there's different types of roles as well. That my PhD background has allowed me to get into some research positions that without a PhD, it would have been quite hard or even impossible to get. But that doesn't mean that because some positions might not be available to you, you should necessarily do a PhD.
Yeah.
So
So
I think I would boil my answer down to, if it really interests you, then I would say yes to it. But if it sounds appalling, then don't do it. You're totally fine without a PhD.
yeah. And so that makes sense, right? And it's obviously a big time commitment, and it's
Yeah.
also foregone income, right? It's 5, 6, 7 years when you're making way less money than you would have otherwise, most likely. And on the other hand, it's a pretty nice lifestyle, I would say.
Funny. It's funny that you say that, because I was thinking about it the other day, that in those years of my PhD, I was earning less, but I was actually having the time of my life.
Yeah.
I was taking all the classes that were interesting to me. I was coming up with research projects that sounded cool. I had much more free time. So yeah, it's really a big trade-off. But I think I would say again that it would come down to, if it sounds cool, if you really want to explore more things, do research, I would say it's definitely worth it. But if being at school, because I know a lot of people who hate being at school.
Yeah, exactly. That's
And
the
then I
point.
would
And
not recommend it for those people. I would not recommend it. And also, I wouldn't say that for those people doing a PhD would be even helpful. So I would say, if you're not into that, then just don't do it. Do
yeah,
it only if it really sounds appealing to you.
yeah, yeah. So I guess you've mentioned research and that you were able to get some research or more research oriented positions in tech thanks to your background. So I would love to talk a bit about what is it specifically that you do, and maybe you could highlight some types of projects or some questions that you've worked on that you think are interesting.
Yeah. So at Zillow, I changed a lot of different teams and positions because of some internal reorgs that happened for a while. But the team that I was in for some of the time was all PhDs. PhD was a requirement to get into that team. And the types of work we did, there was a lot of experimentation. But the reason why PhD was a requirement is because, while, for example, if you're in an A/B testing platform, usually what happens is that you get requests, test X and Y and tell me what performs best. In my team at Zillow, a lot of the time we would had to come up with the research question. It was up to us to talk to product, talk to design, talk to marketing and engineering, understand the context for particular products or lines of businesses, and given our knowledge, our background knowledge from academia, make up research questions, research hypotheses that we thought that could help, and then go test those and then present results to the company. So it was very proactive work. And I think that's oftentimes, not always, but it's oftentimes a bit of a differentiator. Not always. So I just want to put that out there, between positions that require a PhD, because such positions would expect you to bring in that knowledge and be proactive, bring it in and see where it could fit and to improve the business in different ways.
So basically, what I'm hearing is bringing in knowledge that's grounded in, say, behavioral economics theory, and then finding an appropriate place to apply it in a product setting. And then understanding how to properly design an A/B test and how to estimate it. So really combining the theoretical and technical skills with a product sense.
Exactly. I think you really brought it together very nicely. It's that proactive knowledge from academia, but also your technical skills in terms of testing things thoroughly and having the ability to, even not just the academic theory, but also the econometric skills of understanding not just what a p-value is and how, if a hypothesis is just above or just below a p-value threshold, but also understanding outliers, understanding how your data may be prone to some biases, correcting for those biases to the extent that's possible, and really providing as scientific as possible of analysis and recommendation to the business, with the ability also to connect with the business and product people and do something that is actually practical and not just theoretical in some other world. And so that's, I would say that these are positions that would require some level of deep knowledge of research, academic knowledge that is out there, but also strong statistical econometric skills.
Yeah, and I think this highlights, and I guess two things. So one thing is, to some extent, the PhD in theory should quote unquote guarantee that you have that knowledge, right? Even though you can't have that knowledge without that PhD, but it's a signaling device, obvious. So it's a signaling device that you have that knowledge, and it's also something that actually gives you the knowledge. Of course, it's possible to join a company without a PhD and maybe not go right into a role that says PhD required, but then grow into that type of role. I would guess it's less common, but definitely we have seen that as well.
Oh, yeah, totally. And anything is possible. Like, I'm a firm believer that you don't need formal education to acquire any skill, even though it does help in certain situations. Even, for example, when you read and try to interpret research, a lot of the times having the skill to interpret research, because not all research is quality research. And there's a lot of research that is not quality, and understanding even like the trade-offs and nuances and understanding all the caveats that pretty much all research comes with a lot of caveats and a lot of places where it doesn't apply. And a lot of that, if this happens, this may not be applicable. And so just understanding all the background and truth behind how a recommendation is being made or a result is being presented is a big aspect.
Yeah. And I think this highlights another thing that you touched on with the data, right? When you do, say, projects in school, like in undergrad, I think even during the PhD to some extent, I feel like the data tends to be more manicured. Like, you get the data and you somehow know more what you're going to get out of it. But when you work with company data, like user data, and it's messy and incomplete and large, and you're estimating some kind of answer to a problem, there is no supposed answer, right? Hopefully you have an idea of what would be compatible with, say, economics theory to find. If you increase the price, people will buy less, right? Like that sort of thing. But it's like a black hole. So you start working on it, and then you get a number, and then you may run one model and you get one number, and you get to run another model and you get a completely different number. And then what do you do now? And the more experience you have, I think the more comfortable you become in this environment and understand that maybe you have to do 3 models, all of which are reasonable, and see, do they converge on a number? And then that's maybe a good sign, but maybe they don't converge at all, and then you have to keep digging, at which point you also need to have the skill to be able to push back, right? Or to say that there is an inconclusive result, which no one likes to hear in the tech world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And even, it's another big thing that I've had to learn a lot during my time in tech, which is really which data to get. Also cleaning the data, getting the data from the data lake, but also which data should we get. There's most tech companies nowadays, there's like an insane amount of data, both the different types of data, but also the quantity. And so understanding which data to bring out and how to perform the analysis. And then, as you said, understanding the trade-offs between different models, but also the data that you use to train different models and why are results different and which should you trust and which should you not trust, but also the caveats and trade-offs that come with each. Yeah, it's a skill that there is, and oftentimes there's no right answer. There's no clear cut, at least, right answer that you can like Google it and find what the right solution is. So really just having the knowledge, but also the feeling comfortable existing in a little bit of an uncertain world and doing the best you can with what you have.
And I think this kind of goes back to also having good processes for how you work, because then you can fall back on, this is what I did and this is why I did it and this is the result. And if you're comfortable with what you did and why and how, then it's easier to defend the result, whatever the result may be.
Yeah, and being open to feedback. I think
Yeah.
that is also very important. Being open to feedback. You don't know everything, and it's okay. And it's okay to be collaborative and ask for help, ask for others' opinions, and be open to iterate on your result. You do an analysis of the result, being open to completely changing that, or adding more data, or adding less data, or thinking to a different model. And also sometimes being open to doing a lot of work that ends up not being used.
Yeah, that's
For whatever reason, things change fast, especially in tech. Like I would say in tech, out of all the industries, things can change really fast.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're going to do a lot of work that might not get used. And that's okay. It doesn't feel great, but that's okay.
So in terms of people looking for jobs, there's a lot of job titles out there. There's applied scientist, research scientist, economist, econometrician, analyst. What do they mean? Or do they mean the same thing at all companies, or what, or do you don't even look at the title that much when you search for a job?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. And unfortunately, it's a little of the Wild West out there in terms of job titles and what they mean. I would say the most ambiguous title is data scientist because it can literally mean so many different things. So my what I do is I read the job descriptions, and with from the job descriptions you can really get a much better sense of degree requirements, experience, but also exactly what you're going to be doing. For example, a lot of data scientist positions have to do with image classification, or like you need to have experience in those kind of modeling techniques. Others are much more about building data pipelines. Others are more like an economist position. Also, a lot of them might be specific to domains. So there's a lot of positions out there that are related to marketing mix modeling, because obviously marketing and advertising attribution are big topics. Or for example, privacy or other topics of specialized topics, which you might get if you don't have background in it, but if you do have background in particular topics, you might have an advantage. But yeah, data scientist is a little bit of a very vague, broad term that I would say you should, for all the descriptions, I would say it's good to read what it says. Then you get a slightly more specialized roles like applied scientist, which in many companies, an applied scientist and a data scientist can mean the same. Well, an applied scientist and a data scientist in different companies can be doing the same thing. What I've seen a small trend forming an, of companies that have a distinction between a data scientist and an applied scientist. And usually what that means, but once again, do read the job description, but usually what that means is applied scientists tend to be more on the modeling side and using data for insights. Oftentimes they have a PhD, but it wouldn't be a requirement. And a data scientist would be much more on extracting data, using much more SQL, extracting data, pulling data, making dashboards and things like that. If there's a distinction in a company, within a company between applied scientists and data scientists, then a research scientist is also a title that's not used a lot, but it does exist. And companies are like, I think, Amazon and Microsoft have those titles. And they're usually much more focused on deep research and developing new models and maybe new products through.
Yeah.
They are much more on the ML side of things. And you can keep going with I think economists are much more, even though an economist role does not mean that you have a background in economics, but you will probably be doing more causal inference or time series things, or even like content, like public facing.
Yeah.
But I do think that the titles are not at all harmonized across companies, and they can really mean different
things. Yeah. So read the job description as the
read the
baseline.
Job description. Yes.
I think so. And so in terms of getting access to job opportunities, I think networking is an important component, because in the end, in tech, it's quite a small world to some extent. And you end up knowing lots of people in the kind of bigger companies, and then you know people in common and so on. Do you have any tips in terms of networking, and whether it's adding people on LinkedIn or joining any kind of professional organizations or going to conferences? Like, what are the good things to do?
Yeah. So the way I started, which I also, kind of like a promotion of an organization that you and I know well, which is the National Association for Business Economics. This is, I have massive respect for NABE, the National Association for Business Economics, because it really brings together, if you're an economist or economist adjacent, PhD or not, and you're really interested in tech, I would say one of the best, if not the best organization community is NABE. And what's great about them is that they not only have a great website and a job portal, but they do this annual events like conferences that I found massive value in. Is one of the events that I would say I found the most valuable in is the Tech Economics Conference, which happens once a year. I attended the one, was like what, 4 years ago. And that was,
2019, yeah.
yes, Tech 19, which really for me changed my perspective completely on what I wanted to do professionally. Before that, I was still all into academia, but then after that conference, I remember it still to this day, it was one of the biggest aha moments of my career. It was like, that's where I want to be.
And
Yeah,
what was it about the conference that made you have this realization?
it was a realization that there's a community out there that values my skills. It's exciting, interesting, and a community of really nice people that really want to help each other and are interested in much more real world things that in academia, I would say, that utilize skills that I had and I was developing in the PhD. And it just seemed like a really nice community. It really does it sounded like a really nice community. And that's what I've experienced. That's what I've experienced since. Before that conference, I honestly didn't know much of what economists did outside of academia because I was so narrowly focused on academia. And then I just realized that, wow, there's a place where I can do research, but I can do that research in a much more fast-paced way. And I don't have to publish, which I by that time I started being like, oh my God, this publication process is not something that I enjoy. And also you have much more locational flexibility of where you work, especially nowadays with remote work.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good segue into the remote versus in person. What's your experience with it? What's your take on it?
Yeah, so my experience and I guess my take on it has changed a little bit. When I first started, I was, I think, a little bit unlucky because when I was first starting my job, it was with Zillow in Seattle, but then I was actually looking for housing, and that's when the pandemic hit with all the lockdowns, and so I started fully remote. So I never really got to experience the working in person, though we did have a few offsites where we got together for a few days, but that was like once every 6 months or once every year. So I didn't have that many opportunities. And I thought that remote work that's what I wanted, fully remote work. And I still want that, mostly though. Now I have developed a slight preference for some in-person interaction. And that is because I saw some communication benefits of those in-person interactions. I still prefer my everyday today to be remote because it really gives me so much more time to do other things. For example, go to gym or meet with friends in the evening or in the morning before you start work. It's much more efficient. But there is an aspect that I'm recently starting to appreciate of just really being in the same environment in person with both your manager, your colleagues. It helps more spark conversations of just walking down the corridor and seeing a colleague and saying hi, discovering a common interest. Where in the remote world, you need to be a little bit more proactive. You need to really set meetings and talk on Slack, which I think sometimes it can hinder a little bit. that communication aspect. So for me, an ideal scenario is what I think I currently have right now with Netflix, which is mostly remote, but meeting once a week or once every couple of weeks in person to just, I don't know, have a little bit of that in-person interaction.
Connection. Yeah.
The
And
connection.
I guess another way to do it is to have offsites like
Yes.
twice a year or something. Because I
Yes.
think what companies, right, like the problem you run into if it's like whenever you feel like it, go to the office, you could potentially run into a coordination problem where you go to the office and you don't see anyone. But at least me personally, I'm very much against forcing people to go to the office on a certain day.
Oh, me too, me too, me too. But I think what ends up happening, what I'm seeing is that people coordinate with themselves. Oh, when are
Yeah.
you going? When should we go in together? And also people, I think people tend to prefer when it's optional and when some people do want to go in, they tend to, most people tend to like to go in the middle of the week and keep the ends of the week kind of feel like Mondays and Fridays. And then they may go in on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or Thursdays, or like all of those 3 days. But I think having the option and doing that on a, doesn't have to be like super regular, but on a somewhat of a semi-regular basis, it helps. And the offsites are very helpful. There can be a lot of socialization. It's usually 2 or 3 days of like sessions and meetings and dinners, breakfasts all together, but they are very important for team building, connection, communication, which you need a lot for your work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with the current world of increased flexibility, what it allows for is better preference matching. Because we are different and some of us are much more social in the way that we want to be around people when we work, and some people don't. And it will also depend on the job role. If you're a creative director of something, that's probably a very different job than if you're a data engineer.
Yeah, totally. No, 100%. And also, of course, it gives people the flexibility to live wherever they want. And also for companies as well, it gives them the flexibility to hire anyone from across the US or across the world if it makes sense for them. So it gives them a much bigger market. And also, the other thing is that they don't have to maintain those massive offices as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess rounding up, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you think is that you would like to talk about or that I haven't asked you about?
I think I would say my advice is to try to not be limited by your background. Yeah, don't be limited by your background. Just be scrappy. Develop good communication skills. I couldn't, honestly, I'm really big on communications since leaving academia. I'm very big on developing good communication skills. Another thing is everyone has imposter syndrome. It's not just you. I am realizing more and more that the more I speak out about how I have big imposter syndrome, I'm finding that almost everyone speaks out and says that, oh, I was also scared when I first joined and I still. And so the smartest people that you'll see may also have their own fears and also empathy. And it's another big thing, which is related to communication. You're going to get to meet and interact with very different people. And if you're able to make that work, it'll make you better, much better professional, much better individual. And so really just be patient with people, try to really understand their different points of view. The more you're able to do that, the more you're going to get better everything.
Yeah. So I guess kind of to close out, do you have any specific tips or examples of how you improved your communication skills? Because I feel like it sounds good, improve your communication skills, but it's ambiguous too. Like, how do I do that? Do I like go to a speaking club or whatever, debating club, or?
I'm happy to say what I did, which is a combination of I took some online classes on communication.
Okay, where did you find them?
There's a lot in learning on Udemy is another online class. But the other thing I did is I actually hired a coach. I hired a coach, professional coach, for a variety of topics, but mostly to help me improve my communication. And it has been a game changer for me, the way I communicate. And I think the more you work with other people, the more you realize how really important communication is. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should go out and hire a coach. It also can be expensive, but I found massive value in hiring a coach, also for communication, but also for other sorts of aspects that and challenges you might face professionally. How do you navigate a difficult situation? How do you navigate a promotion discussion? How do you navigate all kinds of things, which most of them do come down to communication and empathy.
Yeah, and it's the tool, right? If you have bad communication skills, even if you have a genius idea and solution, it's going to be very hard to make anyone use it. And I think this highlights the fact that coming out from, say, a PhD, especially, or where you've spent like 17 years in school or something like that, in your mind, learning can be connotated with like technical learning. Do I read more papers? And the truth is, if you've done a PhD, by the time you come out of the PhD, unless you're doing some very specialized technical position at some company, in most cases, you should be learning, but learning all the adjacent skills.
Yeah.
Like communication, I think writing is another important one. I've seen so much bad writing out there where you look at something and you don't even understand what it is.
Yeah, like making presentations. You're going to make a lot of presentations in the industry, in tech, and just being able to write, to create engaging slides. Something I'm still not great at, but I'm still learning every day. When I first started, I was making some super complex slides with all kinds of bullet points and graphs and equations. And I think there's a trend that I'm noticing of having less and less and less on a slide, even up to the point where you have an empty slide with like even an icon sometimes.
Yeah.
And then talking through the idea. It's another big important skill, how to communicate ideas. And none of these things are rocket science. I think just having a positive attitude, going in, send a lot of applications out there, put yourself out there, practice interviewing, and then just be humble, be nice, be helpful, because people will be helpful to you. So reciprocate, being helpful, and work on communicating, and just being a nice, helpful person.
Just be you.
Yeah, which oftentimes it feeds back in. If you try to be nice, then you also then become nicer too, and because your environment pushes you. I found that at Zillow, when I first joined, everyone was so nice to me and so helpful that it made me want to be nice and helpful as well. Whereas coming from academia, I started developing more like strict communication, or this does not make sense, and just, or like, why would I be helpful, and things like that. But when you're in an environment where like everyone wants to help and everyone wants to collaborate and help you and make your life easier, let it flow through you and also make you that kind of person as well.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess the last thing, like, where can people find you if they want to reach out or say hi or ask a question?
Yeah, I think I would say LinkedIn is probably the best means. A lot of people do reach out on LinkedIn, even people that I don't know. A lot of people want to ask, get my perspective on working in tech, or they want a referral. LinkedIn, Andreas Aristidou, is probably the best way to reach me. And I'm more than happy. I love talking to people and just sharing my experiences and whatever learnings I've gotten in the last few years, because people have done that for me. Again, people have done that for me, and I'm very happy when I have the opportunity to do that for others.